Yes, hello and good evening and a big welcome here to 5 by 15. I know that today is called Blue Monday, but I'm pretty confident that by the end of tonight's event, you won't be feeling as blue as you are. This is a really brilliant 5 by 15 ahead of you with tales of families, of legacies, of identity and consolation. And we're going to discover how you stay sane online, as well as journeying up to the Arctic tree line to see if this really is one of the frontiers of climate change. It's an evening, we hope, of inspiration during these, well, ridiculously dark months, and there's a wonderful range of stories ahead. So please sit back, get yourself a cup of tea or a drink, and prepare to be entertained and uplifted in the next hour and a bit. Thank you all, as ever, for joining us. The event is free, but we're always happy to take contributions. And as well as that, please support our wonderful, wonderful speakers by buying their books. All the details of all the books we're going to hear about tonight will be in the chat, and our independent book partner, Newer Books, will be, of course, very happy to help. So first up is the fantastic Emma Gannon, who is the author of a really brilliant new book, which is out this week, Disconnected, how to stay human in a digital world. This is such an important topic, not least because during the pandemic, we spent so much more time online than we ever did before. And along with Emma being a best-selling author, she's also the host of the acclaimed podcast, Control, Alt, Delete, that has reached almost 10 million downloads. So Emma, over to you to kick us off, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I've followed this event for a long time, so it's great to be here. As Rosie said, my new book is all about how to stay human in an online world. And really, those were the questions I wanted to ask. It could be classed as self-help, but I'm less about the answers and more about the broader discussion. So I wanted to kind of talk you through some of the questions I've been asking in the book. So first of all, I wanted to ask, what does it mean to be human? And after 2 years of reduced physical contact and a steep rise in our screen time, I think this question is really for everyone. Like, what makes us who we are? And so much of our life is spent online now. There is no separation really between who we are online and who we are offline. It really is one big merge, and how we act and how we treat each other on the internet really should reflect our offline life as well. And there's this idea of being a citizen online and offline. I wanted to write this book because for me it always comes from a personal place, and it also comes from an anecdotal place, and then I look at the research and sort of connect the dots. And there is so much research at the moment about how this is a topic on everyone's lips, really. How do we stay human and how do we treat each other better on the internet? So many of my friends felt dehumanized during the pandemic. And I think one friend said to me that she felt like a content farm, this idea of typing and producing and pressing buttons. And we felt like machines. We felt like we were just working during the pandemic, most of us. We weren't really out in nature as much. We weren't with our loved ones. And we weren't really our physical selves. We were socially distancing, and we were literally just tapping and typing behind screens for most of it. And suddenly we're in a world of endless Zooms, and we're still on it now. And hopefully we'll be in person again doing events like this. And we were static avatars. We were reduced to online arguments. 1 in 4 people on WhatsApp misunderstood each other during the pandemic, and people were falling out with their loved ones because we didn't have tone of voice. We didn't have our body language. We have fake followers. We have the rise in AI, and we have virtual customer service, which is the biggest bane of my life, and really gets me when I can't speak to an actual human when I'm just trying to get my sofa fixed or whatever it might be. In 2016, I wrote a book called Control, Alt, Delete, How I Grew Up Online. And that was a young millennial perspective on growing up alongside the internet. I basically found out that the World Wide Web had been invented in 1989, and I was born in 1989. And I thought it would be quite interesting to see how we both grew up together, the internet in its infancy, and I was in my infancy. So I wrote a book about that, and I was quite giddy at the time. I was so excited by the internet, and I still am. Obviously, it's one of the greatest tools ever, and we can do so much, and we can make such a positive life for ourselves. I made friends, I made a career, I could write for a living, I could work from home, and it was amazing. But looking on 5 years since that book, actually 6 years since that book, and then a pandemic in between, my outlook towards the internet has changed, and I have obviously grown up even more so. And it's interesting that I am in the digital native generation, which means that all of my life has spent on the internet, but it's very different from Gen Z, who would have grown up with a smartphone. I didn't grow up with a smartphone. I had some sort of childhood before that. But when we look at this broader reflection, I think for me, it's interesting to see how much of that childhood was positively learning and being educated by the internet, and how much was sowing the seeds for a later addiction. And in the book, I am quite openly honest that I do think I am addicted to the internet. I think addiction is a strong word, but there is this element of reaching for something first thing in the morning that doesn't sit quite right. And if it was reaching for a black coffee, or if it was reaching for a cigarette, the way that I'm constantly reaching for my phone, it was something that I wanted to look at. And I wanted to analyze this relationship that I have with my internet as though it was a person. It's always been there, but it's always evolving. And just as we renegotiate our relationship with alcohol or meat or the environment, I wanted to really look at the technology I'm using through a personal lens, but hopefully share some insights as well. So I know that a huge influence for a lot of people of my generation is Zadie Smith. And I started to realize that my screen time was really impacting my creativity. She's someone that's always sort of shunned social media and phones. And she has said in the past in an interview that she couldn't control herself on the internet, and she would go down Beyonce, Google rabbit holes. So she had to curb her addiction to it, and otherwise she wouldn't write any books. So that's sort of where it started for me to really analyze, what am I doing? Like, I'm wasting so much of my time here. I'm so distracted, and it's really, really impacting the things that I want to do. And we can see from, all of the research at the moment, we're going through the great resignation. People want more from their lives. People want to have hobbies. They want to be creative. We want to enjoy our lives. And the elephant in the room is that we are spending a lot of time on our devices, whilst also saying we don't have any time. So there is something to be said for, where does our time actually go? The other thing I wanted to look at in the book is something that I was always championing, which was the personal brand. This idea of, actually, it's not wasting your time building this career online, because it's helping you sort of maintain some sort of career. We all have to be online for our jobs mostly. So I wanted to unpick that and really look at this virtual self that we have now. In a book that I quote in my book, this book called Virtually You by Elias Obajade was a huge inspiration. He coined the phrase e-personality. And in my book, I'm kind of prompting the reader to really look at that e-personality, this self that we've created, that we can actually like more than we like our offline self. We might look better, we might be more confident, we might be able to sum up who we are in pixels better than we can in real life sometimes. But when I realized all of these things that I wanted to change, I realized that digital detoxes did not work. It's like a diet. It's not the answer. We can't just put our phone in a drawer for a month and cut everything out and hope it all fixes. But we also, most of us, can't actually step away from the internet for a month because we are so addicted. So in my book, I am giving micro detox prompts. How do you get yourself back again? How do you rediscover who you are whilst also enjoying the internet for what it is? So one of the prompts in there is about rediscovering yourself outside of algorithms. So who are you outside of a Spotify playlist? What music did you listen to when you were younger? What books do you think you want to read without Amazon trying to tell you who you are before you stumble across something you might enjoy? What do you want to wear without the influence of Instagram? And a lot of it is really just stripping back all the layers of who we were before. The Social Dilemma documentary obviously came out in early 2020, and I think that was the time where we started to really realize what was going on. Just even the idea of swiping down is the same as a slot machine. We were given information that shocked us, but we weren't really given a solution at the end. And that is what I tried to do in this book. If you are feeling like you're spending too much time on your phone, but you don't want another book telling you to log off for a week and go into a cabin and have a digital detox, this is sort of a middle ground of really gentle prompts to try and just get some time back for yourself in a way that isn't really overwhelming. The other part of it really is accountability. How much can we actually do without feeling like we can just sort of blame the tools all the time? Because we know that over dependence on our phones causes anxiety and stress. We know that even having the phone on the table, it actually reduces our cognitive capacity. And we also know that when we are with friends and they're on their phone, we feel less connected to them. And one thing that keeps coming up is that this is not young people. This is people trying to tell their parents to get off their phone when they're trying to have a family dinner. So I hope that the book can be a middle ground. And I wanted to leave you with some sort of practical things, because this is going very quickly. I've been talking for 9 minutes already. Number one is to remind ourselves of what makes us human. For me, it is making mistakes. It's long form conversation, it's laughter, it's curiosity, it's forgiveness, it's creativity, it's community. It's the opposite of cancel culture in my eyes. It's also resting. It's the ability to not be productive. That's what makes us human. It's not really a compliment to call someone a machine, especially if you're an author kind of writing multiple books. You're not a machine, you're a human who probably finds it quite hard to produce things at the same rate every single day. We go through ups and we go through downs, and it's not as consistent. I personally decided to split out my social media feeds between work and personal. Getting my personal sort of online life back actually helped me connect more deeply with the people who were sort of in my inner circle. Not everything has to be a promotion. I started journaling again. I started writing by hand again. My handwriting was terrible, tried to get that back. I stopped being productive just to see how that would feel and kind of going into that discomfort. I also used the Marie Kondo technique, where she would say, get rid of it if it doesn't spark joy. Try and do that with your feeds, because we change so often. So something that would inspire us even a month ago probably won't inspire us necessarily now. Also, avoid Twitter arguments or arguments of any kind that are in snippets. During the pandemic, whenever I was getting into some sort of heated debate, I actually offered to have a Google Hangout with someone, which I know for a lot of people, probably you just think, I don't want to do that and I don't have time. But it was so brilliant and really eye-opening. And I made brilliant connections because we got to go beyond the very quick nature of just disagreeing in 140 characters. I tried to be more active with my phone and less passive. So instead of just doom scrolling and just scrolling while you're, waiting for the bus or waiting for something to heat up in the microwave, only use your phone when you have something to actually do with it. Don't fall into that sort of glazed over, can't get out of this loop. And the other thing was to stumble across things more. So not everything has to be targeted to you. Go into bookshops and just buy a random book. Or there's a study actually that most people now book a holiday based on the photos they'll get that they can then share on social media. So there's lots in the book to think about of how we can change our habits without the digital detox. But my last question for you would be, how can you use the internet to enhance your real life and your real relationships and the person who is on the other side of the screen? So I hope I crammed everything in for you there, but thank you so much for listening, and back over to you, Rosie.
Emma, thank you so much. That was so extremely interesting. I have to say I hadn't heard of the e-personality before, but I thought that was such an interesting idea, and all your stuff about, you know, I find that whole thing again when you read newspapers online, that you don't ever find the small tiny piece that is in fact the really intriguing one that you didn't even know you were interested in. And you're quite right about you have to go into bookstores and not just be guided by Amazon. So thank you very much. I personally can't wait to read that book, and I'm absolutely aware that I need it, and I do reach for my phone in the morning. So that was great. Thank you. Thank you. Now our next speaker is Huma Abedin, who made lots of headlines over the course of her career. She's joining us from Manhattan. She was a long-time aide to Hillary Clinton when she was First Lady. She was a senator when she was presidential candidate, Secretary of State, as well as Democratic presidential nominee. Huma has now written her own memoir called Both Stroke And, which is about growing up in America as a Muslim, and also the dramatic stories of her marriage to the former congressman Anthony Weiner. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're really excited about listening to you talk tonight. I know you've been on an in-person tour around America, and your book Both And is a strong New York Times bestseller. So welcome here to 5 by 15, and over to you.
Rosie, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to join you, and I want to thank Daisy and Stephanie and Alex and everyone at 5 by 15 for including me tonight. And I certainly need a copy of Emma's book. I did end up writing my memoir, Both And, A Life in Many Worlds, during the pandemic, and it did turn out to be a bit of therapy and a little bit of detox too. So I'm looking forward to picking up a copy of her book, and I'm honored to be on the same panel as all these authors and creators who I really admire. So thank you for letting me participate. And for me, I have to say I've always believed my life has been a combination of fate, luck, and hard work. And for much of it, I really have been a refraction of somebody else's pronoun. They, as in my parents, she, as in my boss, Hillary Clinton, and he, as in who I was married to for many years, Anthony Weiner, who Rosie just mentioned. And I realized I was fine. I loved being invisible. I loved being the person behind the scenes. I've been in politics and public service in the United States, and I cringe as I use this number, for a quarter of a century. Until I was forced off the treadmill in 2016 when Hillary lost the presidential election. And I liked being invisible. I liked doing my job and staying behind the scenes, until I realized that while I remained silent, everyone else was telling my story. And most of those stories were actually inaccurate. And so I chose to sit down and write my own truth and reclaim my own history. I was raised by two academics. My father always encouraged me to study history, even though he always said, your eyes are at the front of your head for a reason. It's to look forward. You needed to understand the choices, the decisions, things that happened in the past to understand how to make those decisions in your future. I'm the product of immigrant parents, an Indian father, a Pakistani mother, and really the testament in my life, the person whose legacy I really wrote this book to honor, was my grandmother, my 8-year-old grandmother in 1910 in India, who demanded to be educated, who demanded to go to school, living in a society and a community where girls did not do that. So over the years, every time I have walked on Air Force One or flown on Marine One, or the number of times I've been privileged to be in places, palaces, and met living legends, every instance in my life I really owe to that dream that she carried out, to go to school. She raised my mother, who was essentially self-taught, born in India, was a refugee to Pakistan, and became a Fulbright scholar, where she made it to the University of Pennsylvania, met my father, who was also a product of public servants in India, and he too became a Fulbright scholar. They met in Philadelphia, and they decided to embrace this new life, to hold on to traditions that were important to them, but to assimilate in this community. And they did. They moved to Michigan, which is where I was born. And when I was 2, my father was diagnosed with renal failure. He was a political scientist teaching at the Western Michigan University, and my mother was a sociologist. And one of the first lines I wrote in my book was, my father was told he was dying. And so he went out and he lived. And 2 months later, they accepted a sabbatical to Saudi Arabia. And it was a choice between going to Italy and going to Saudi Arabia. And my mother actually tells me that they meant to go to Italy until my father received this diagnosis, and they thought the opportunity of showing us a part of the world and part of our faith and culture, I'm a Muslim American, as Rosie mentioned, was really important to them. And that is how I spent my childhood, growing up in Jeddah, living a very international life in the midst of an international community. We had a very strong community. My father always, we had lots of plants in our house, and my father always said that people are like plants, and a plant is only as good as its roots. And if you nourish those roots, if you take care of that soil, it doesn't matter, winter, storm, rain, that plant is going to be okay. And they inculcated that into us from a very young age. And every summer we would hop on a plane and we'd explore a new part of the world. We went to Asia and Europe and Africa, Middle East, obviously the United States and Canada, the UK, once or twice a year. And it gave us, my parents really wanted us to learn about the world, to respect other languages, cultures, people, and traditions. And so I feel as though that kind of grounding, there's also this notion of forcing us to grow up. And I think in part because my father didn't know how long he would have with us. When I was 5, 6, 7, 8, I have memories of being sent out into the living room to greet our guests, or getting on the phone with the airlines to book our flights to Bangkok, doing things that I thought I was not old enough to do and that I was too scared to do. But I did it because he told me I could do it. And I lost my father when I was 17, just before I left for university. But I feel like when I walked into the White House at 21 in 1996, I brought that perspective, those roots, that grounding that my parents instilled in me growing up in the way that I was able to be raised. And I walked into the White House, there weren't a lot of other Muslim Americans. There certainly weren't a lot of women like me walking around. And back then, America, might be hard to remember now, but it was arguably the sole superpower in the world. And I was working in the Clinton administration. I wasn't even sure if I was a Democrat or a Republican. Actually, most of my family was Republican back then, but it felt like a cause. Here you had a president who was championing peace in the Middle East. He was overseeing a robust economy. There was a first lady who was traveling the world, championing women's rights as human rights. And I was taught 2 lessons when I walked into the White House. Number 1 was fail to plan, plan to fail. So everything about my life and work was doing it right, being perfect, doing the best. I wasn't the smartest. I wasn't the prettiest. I wasn't the best at what I did, but I was prepared to outwork everybody all the time. And so we had very much a sink or swim attitude. And I share many stories in the book about what it was like on my first trips, what I didn't know what I was doing when I had to go in to the president and first lady's bedroom to wake up the first lady because she was late for a trip and I didn't know how to do it. And it was basically a disaster. Or my very first trip to New York, when I flew on a helicopter with the president and first lady, and they were on Marine One, and I was on one of the staff helicopters, and my helicopter landed first, and I'm taking off all the luggage, then my helicopter takes off and Marine One lands. And as Marine One lands, it lifts up Hillary's clothes and flings her entire hanging bag into the East River. And I have to run and find somebody to fish it out. Never told her the story until many years later. We did fish it out. We did manage to get it dry cleaned. So you did whatever it took. It was such an exciting, incredible place to be. And that translated into this incredible job in the Senate, which unfortunately coincided with 9/11 and the war on terror. And it changed those of us who are New Yorkers. It changed everything about the way we lived, the way we experienced the world, the way our lives and our inner lives and psychology were just shaken and shattered in a way that I think we just could never have anticipated. And then to be on this incredible 2008 presidential campaign when Hillary was the first woman to make history. I share the stories in the book of what that experience was like and what being in a world where there weren't a lot of men, how hard it was, how we didn't know how to deal with a lot of the sexism and misogyny. We just laughed, all of us, even those of us in the campaigns, when people commented on her clothes or her hair. Doesn't matter that she was one of the most qualified, people on the stage. It was just the price we thought we had to pay. And, Emma was talking earlier about the time that she grew up in the world. I was raised in the Clinton world of politics. And so that was the early 90s or the mid 90s. And it was the dawn of 24-hour cable news. And so every day we had a proactive message and we ignored the nonsense. If we were talking about healthcare, that's all we talked about every single day. And we ignored anything that wasn't that. In 2008, all of that was changing. And I think everyone who's watching knows how that campaign ended. I was really proud to then join President Obama's administration to work at the State Department alongside Hillary, to go back out into the world, to go back to countries, many of which I had gone to as a child with my parents, but to go back representing my country, which to me was always a point of pride, and the incredible experiences and challenges and how to navigate our way in the world, to go into countries and places that were sovereign nations that felt sometimes a little put upon when the West would come in and tell them how they should live and act and form their governments. And to live in that both and world, I always, said I lived along the seams, understanding both perspectives, living with one foot in one world and another foot in another. And then in the middle of all that, to meet the love of my life, to fall in love, to get married, and then to have to endure that heartbreak and betrayal on the national news here. I think for many years, the headlines in the United States about to me were, what is wrong with her and what is she thinking? And I chose to stay. I share a story in the book about waking up at Buckingham Palace. I was secretly pregnant. I wasn't even 12 weeks pregnant when the news broke about Anthony, and how my life changed, and how the judgment, the sort of extrication from society, the disinvitations from parties, and what that does to you to live with shame and to live in that kind of trauma. And it's one of the many reasons I wrote the book, because I think a lot of people, particularly women, unfortunately have had to go through what I went through and are going through it. And the number of people who reached out to me then and now has just been overwhelming, and really, I feel like it's a small service that I'm able to provide, I think. And then the 2016 campaign, the history that Hillary Clinton made, all the outside forces that affected that election, my role in it, the incredible opportunities we had, and the tragedy. I get up every single day and I think about how different our country would have been if Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016. And I hope when people walk away from this book that they realize she would have been an extraordinary leader, an extraordinary president. And now that I'm on a book tour and traveling around this country, I have to say my favorite places to go speak are at universities. And young women always ask me, what do you think? What is your advice? And I always tell them to do the thing that scares them the most, because that's what I'm doing right now. I've done the thing that scares me the most. I've put it all down there. I'm out in the world, and I find it to be not terrifying, not something I regret, but it's really gratifying and really liberating. And as we live in an increasingly divided political country here, I think it's all the more important that more voices and different voices step forward and speak their truth. And it's an honor and a privilege that I've been able to have a few minutes of your time to share mine. Thank you all and have a good evening.
Oh, Huma, thank you so much. That was a really inspirational talk, and I cannot wait to read the book. And I and every woman I know absolutely agrees with you. If only Hillary had won that election, and it does feel that one was wrong. So thank you so much for taking the time. And actually, it's very interesting that you single out your grandmother and her ability to go and get educated, because our next speaker, Honorée Fanonne Jeffers, and her extraordinary book, The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, the question of women's education is absolutely central to this story and keeps recurring all through it. I'm extremely lucky because I've managed to get an early copy of this, and I have almost finished it. And I cannot tell you both how extraordinary it is, but also how extraordinarily enjoyable. I have been just adoring every page of this. Honorée is a poet. This is her first novel. It's a monster of in wonderful proportions. It's already an absolutely huge success in America, picked by Oprah Winfrey and one of Barack Obama's favorite books. And it is a side of America that you don't often see dealt with that way. So I'm terribly pleased that she's joining us from Oklahoma City, I think, and it's wonderful.
Norman.
Okay, the book comes out next week, and Honorée, welcome, and thank you so much for coming to share your time with us. So the title, The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. Why W.E.B. Du Bois? Who was he, and why has he had such an influence over your life and indeed over this whole extraordinary book?
Well, thank you, Rosie, for having me. I'm just happy to be here, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say happy Martin Luther King Jr. birthday. W.E.B. Du Bois, it would be Du Bois if he was, French, but it was anglicized here. He shows up in the book and looms large for three reasons. The first is just in terms of the plot and the character development. There's a character, Uncle Root, who is very beloved of the protagonist, Ailey, and he worships Du Bois, as if he's still living at the time that the Ailey story begins. And he has this random kind of connection, meeting with Du Bois, and it really pushes and directs his entire life. The second reason that Du Bois is in the book is because W.B. Du Bois is the greatest African-American intellectual of the 19th and the 20th century. He lived nearly 100 years. And I just mentioned Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He actually died the day before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. And so he fuels every Black intellectual from the early, 1900s until now. His debates with Booker T. Washington in print as to what was supposed to be the role of the African American in American society. For educated African Americans, there's no way that you can get past W.B. Du Bois. You read him, if you go to a historically Black college, you read him in history classes, you read him in sociology classes, you read him in political science, you read him if you're studying literature. And even if you do not attend a historically Black college in America, what happens is you will be told you are not truly educated as a Black person until you read at least 2 works by W.B. Du Bois. And the third reason is that his words constitute a metaphor as you move throughout the book for Black history, Black culture, and the Black experience in America. There's a feeling that his words give the book, I hope, I try to create a mood, so that every major section you will see his words and then they will connect in some way to.
Yes, that is absolutely true. He's very powerful in a kind of shadowy presence as well as a real presence. So in the book is a complicated structure, but essentially it's the story of a family and a group of people and the heritage of Ailey, who is your heroine in today. It's free Blacks, it's enslaved people, it's Scottish colonial, as well as Native American. And you bring us this whole story. So can you tell us how the genesis of how this whole wonderful saga knits together?
Well, I think any artist, you first just start with a nascent idea or maybe even just a pulse in your spirit, if that makes sense. And then as you continue to work on the piece, then it starts to take shape. The story really, the novel is really about America writ large. So while it's a family drama, it's really about America. And, so I want to tell people that, because I think, sometimes whenever there's a family, people automatically assume this is about a family. And then what I've noticed is people get into the book and they're like, there's a lot of stuff in here. And I'm like, that's because it's about America. But I always laugh that the novel actually was just supposed to be a much shorter beach read. And so what happened was, I had an agent, and I still have her, and she's quite beloved. I'm very close to her. And she told me, when I told her I only wanted to write short stories, she said, well, there's no money in stories. She's, very nurturing, but also very honest. And so I lied to her that I was going to write her a novel. And I figured I'd get the novel out of the way, and then I'd come back to what I really love to do, which is write stories. And so I'd send her little excerpts, and she'd be very nurturing and encouraging, but she'd always say, this seems like a story. This doesn't seem like it's going anyplace. It's part of a novel. And so then I was really trying to write Ailey's story, but far less serious than what you see in the book. And then I started having dreams, and these people would come to me, and they'd be dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and I would see a plantation house in the distance. And then when I would wake up, there would be prose selections in my head, and they'd be very lyrical. And that's how it started to take shape as a different, as a much different book than I had envisioned.
So a lot of the book takes place in a long time ago. I mean, I was really fascinated by all the intermarriage between so many different ethnic groups that were in particularly the southern states. Was that something you knew, or something that you discovered and researched?
Well, I am Afro-Indigenous. I'm a multiracial person, but I identify as Black. And also, one of the reasons I do that is there's no way that anybody would look at me and think, hey, she's not a Black person. But I have European ancestry on both sides, white slaveholders. And then I have Indigenous, Native American on both sides. And there are many Black people in America who have at least one non-African ancestor. A lot of us just don't talk about it because we identify as African American. So I already knew that. But in terms of the granular details, as it were, of Native American culture and Native American life, that is something that I spent a lot of time researching. I'm out here in Oklahoma, and this was one of the places where when Native Americans' land was stolen from them, and then they were violently ejected from the southeastern United States, this is where they ended up, the 5 southeastern tribes, including the Creek and the Cherokee. So I'd never read a book like that, a novel. I'd read, history books. And so I thought, first, I just wanted to write a book that, as Toni Morrison talks about, a book that I wanted to read. But second of all, I knew that it wouldn't be respectful if I did not start in the beginning with the Native American people who occupied that land.
Yes, I mean, it's one of the many enormous strengths of that book. I learnt so much from it. And you certainly have this terrible feeling of the violence that began America at the early times that you write about. We haven't got masses of time, but I wanted to pick up on a thread that, no, it's much more than a thread. It's a whole like yarn thread, the importance of educating girls in particular, and your wonderful college, Routledge College, that it comes in and out of the story in all sorts of different ways. What is the state of girls' education, particularly young black girls' education now?
Well, we do very well. Black women are of course having issues in the United States because of racism, white supremacy, and misogyny. But in terms of the community and those people who receive the most education, it would be Black women. And that's one of the things that I wanted to focus on, because typically Black women, even though we hold up the community, we're pushed a lot to the background. And so, as I say, when you get to the end of the book, I have a little afterword and I say, this is a Black feminist novel. I'm unashamed about that. I wanted to write an epic about America that was written from the point of view of people and women who look like me, dark brown skinned women, and to place them in the forefront. So yes, women's education is incredibly important to love songs.
Is Routledge College a real place, or is it a fictional place?
It's both a real and a fictional place. There is no college named Routledge College, but there are many historically Black colleges in the United States, like Routledge. In particular, Spelman College was founded to educate African-American women. My mother is a graduate of Spelman College, and my two sisters, one of my sisters is late, are graduates of Spelman College, and I am a graduate of Talladega College, which is an historically Black college.
I have one last question for you, and that is, it's such a dazzling achievement, this book. It's so complex as well, and it's so extraordinarily, you have so many different strands, and you take people forwards and backwards, and I've never at any moment felt lost or not knowing where I was. You said at the beginning that you were a short story writer. So here's a book that's what, 700 pages. Did you plan it all out? 790, okay. Did you plan it all out? Because the complexity of it, it's like a massive jigsaw puzzle. Did you have it all in your head before you began?
No, I didn't. But what I did have, if this doesn't sound silly, I had it all in my spirit. And my spirit spoke to me. And whenever I would get frustrated or frightened, then I would have dreams, and my spirit would speak to me, and I would get up and I would keep on going.
Well, I have to say, I say a very big thank you to you and your spirit, because this has been a total joy, this book. I can't recommend it too highly to all of our viewers. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and I hope one day we meet in person rather than over the airwaves. Look after yourself.
Thank you so much.
On to our next speaker, who is Ben Rawlance, and Ben is a widely published author who wrote an absolutely extraordinary book called The City of Thorns, which is about a refugee camp, which effectively has got so big that it's become a city. And he's also, the refugee camp was in the Horn of Africa. Ben is also the co-founder of the brand new Black Mountain College in the Brecon Beacons. And it's a college which is about creating a sustainable and good future for nature and for humans. But he's here today to talk about his new book, which is called The Treeline, The Last Forest and the Future of Life on Earth. And it tells the story of what's actually happening with our climate, about what's happening with the fortunes of the forests in the very extreme north of our planet. So Ben, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Rosie. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be on this panel with so many fantastic authors. I've got a lot of reading to do, it seems. And it's a curious thing, writing a book, because you become associated with it and then people expect you to keep writing about the same thing. So when I told people that my next book was going to be about the Arctic, having written several books on Africa, there were a few raised eyebrows, and one person said, that's a bit of a stretch. But the connection between the Arctic and the tropics is actually a lot stronger than you might think, because of course, climate breakdown affects the sensitive parts of the planet first. So having finished that book, City of Thorns, and understanding more and more as the project went on, the extent to which the conflict and the displacement that I was witnessing was driven by climate change, I began looking for other examples, other parts of the world where we could see this process in action, where we could see climate breakdown perhaps as history already, and we could perhaps catch a glimpse of the future that awaits the rest of us. So I began digging around and doing research, and came across this very arresting image of the trees and the forest moving north towards the pole. I discovered that the forest was on the move, and the trees were turning the white Arctic green. They shouldn't be on the move. That's not supposed to happen. And this sinister fact has huge consequences, as I was to find out, for all life on Earth. Could we have the first slide, the map, please? So hopefully you can see now this bird's eye view of the North Pole, and you can see this dark gray, if I'm afraid publishers can't afford color pictures these days, but the dark gray is the green halo at the top of the world, which is the Boreal Forest. It contains 1/3 of all the trees on Earth, more than the Amazon. The Boreal is truly the lung of the world. And this is its present position. This is the top line towards the pole is the present position of the tree line. But where once upon a time it was moving at centimeters a year towards the North Pole, now it's galloping forward at 20, 30, 40, 50 meters at a time. So you might think more trees is a good thing, right? More carbon dioxide, more oxygen. But while the trees might be having a ball in some parts of the Arctic, for all those other species, including humans that have evolved to rely on things as they are, that's not so great. So as you'll see, you can't quite see here, but the top of the tree line in Europe does a slice across the top of Scandinavia, in Finnmark, in northern Norway. And that was where I went to witness what was happening to the birch. And I spoke to a woman called Berit Utsi, who is the secretary of the Sami Reindeer Herders Association in Norway. And she lives in a house surrounded by birch trees in a young forest. But she told me that when she was growing up, the forest, the house was in the middle of the tundra. What's happening for the Sami is a disaster, because for 10,000 years they have evolved, co-evolved with the reindeer to follow the reindeer migrating across the tundra. Now, the reindeer find their way through their own sense of direction, through the stars, through their awareness of the magnetic field, and also through their knowledge of the landscape. But the landscape is changing and is becoming unrecognizable. So in this second picture, which hopefully Daisy can show you, is the view from Berit's house, where you see the tundra, this once upon a time, this white, pristine plain across which the reindeer would navigate, is now completely overrun by these stubby Krumholtz birch trees. And the reindeer get confused, they can't find their way. And of course, the trees catch more snow, the snow insulates the ground, it melts the permafrost, the roots of the birch trees encourage microbial activity, which melts the permafrost more, and so on. So you get the whole of the soil is boiling up with vegetation, and it's completely trashing their way of life. So for the Sami, the birch was once their handmaiden. It was what they used for cooking utensils, for sleds, for tent poles, all kinds of things. But now it's become an enemy. And Berit, when I interviewed her, was suffering from depression. She said the trees have become too much, and now she's training to be a teacher. The thing about ecosystems is that they're hugely complex, and one of the key things I learned on this journey was how complex and differentiated they are. So whilst in Scandinavia the birch trees are on the march, in Russia, a bit further along where I went, it's a completely different story. The Boreal Forest is actually shrinking. And the reason for that is that in Russia, the forest is largely made up of larch, and larch has co-evolved with the permafrost. So when the changes happen to the permafrost, they also affect the range of the larch. Now, larch trees, I learned so much on this book and through this research, and only some of it's in the book, but hopefully you'll learn something too if you read it. But the larch trees breathe through their roots as well as through their needles. So in intact permafrost, that's great because there's lots of air pockets. But when the permafrost melts, the soil becomes waterlogged and the larch effectively drown. So what's happening in Russia is that band of boreal forest at the top that is shrinking because the larch trees are drowning and the tundra is becoming waterlogged. And in the south, these huge wildfires are burning up, increasing the steppe from Mongolia and Kazakhstan. So hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of forest are being destroyed, and the forest is actually shrinking like this. It's a challenge to maps, and it's hard to grasp what's going on. There's enormous changes happening year on year. Things are shifting all the time. It's no wonder that the maps are out of date, but it's not just a challenge to maps. It's also a challenge to our own imagination, to how we think of the planet. And I mean, to some extent, the planet we think we live on is no more. It's already something else. So this third slide, which I'd like to show you, is a place called Arimas, and that means forest island. These are the most northerly trees on the planet. They're 72 degrees north. And it took us several days of driving in this awful, huge Arctic truck with 3 very disagreeable Russian men and 5 liters of vodka and a couple of rifles to get to this point. They really didn't want to go. They couldn't see the point of it. If we'd have carried on driving across the Arctic Ocean, which is just beyond the frame of the photo, we would have reached the North Pole in about another day. But I wanted to go there because this is the climax of the tree line. This is the most northerly trees in the world, to see what was happening. But of course, when we got there, we checked the measurements and had a brief from the scientists and discovered that, of course, these trees haven't moved for 20 years. They haven't even grown for 20 years, because although the temperature has gone up by an average of 20 degrees, it's now -40 instead of -60. So it's not enough to make an appreciable change to the tree line. So the Russian guys, my translator and the driver who came with me, were delighted. They said, "You see, this is nonsense. Your idea about the trees moving is not true." So on one level, it's hard to notice. But then the next day, we went to see the ornithologist of the National Park of Arimas, who spends his summers observing birds. And he described to us how he had begun to see forest species from the Black Sea, north of the tree line at Arimas, on the shore of the Arctic Ocean, birds like hoopoes and ravens and certain kinds of finches. And he was utterly shocked. So we have to catch up. Our brain, in a way, is playing catch up, just like the trees are playing catch up with how we think, what we think of the planet is. And we went then to stay with the Dolgan nomads, similar relatives of the Sami once upon a time. And they live on the tundra near Arimas, and they had noticed new kinds of grasses, new butterflies, new insects. And the other thing they had spotted was bubbles in the ice. So we were staying in a canvas tent at -45, and all of our water came from a nearby lake. We had to go and dig it out with an ice pick and then melt it on the fire. And when it was my turn to do this job, I looked down on this kind of what looked like glass, really, kind of glass, black glass surface, and you look down into the depths, and there, suspended in the ice, you see these tiny little bubbles, these very beautiful, exquisite things. They look like pearls. When we took some of those shards back into the tent, the Dolgans took great delight in lighting them. And of course, they give this little pop because it's methane. And they thought this was hilarious, but there's nothing funny about methane. And that for me was a revelation, to think that we were standing on this enormous territory. Siberia, 2 million square miles, and it's half of the Boreal Forest. 15% of the world's surface is permafrost, and most of it is projected to be gone by the end of this century. We've got no idea how much carbon dioxide and methane is in that permafrost, and we've got no idea how fast it's being released either. And methane is not accounted for in IPCC models because it's too hard to model. So what I learned on this journey was how much we don't know. There is the wonder of this incredible forest and these geophysical systems which are purifying the air and driving the winds and the rain and the climate of the Northern Hemisphere. But there are processes underway which are unstoppable. Warming is happening, and there's very little we can do about it. We can slow it down by all means, but 2 degrees of warming is committed already. What that means is that we are on the brink of a new epoch in the life of our planet. And that means that my children are among the last generation to be born who will know what seasonal climates are, what the seasonal cycles are, what familiar species and human culture that rests on the stability of the climate. And that's really tough. And that's why eco-anxiety and grief and all of these things are top of the agenda. But at the same time, accepting that the status quo is unsustainable is also an opportunity. It's not the end of human life as we know it, but it does mean we have to adapt and we have to evolve. And the other lesson of the forest is that nature is a system. As I'm sure you know, the tree needs the fungi, the flower needs the pollinator, the tree is firing aerosols into the atmosphere to create its own climate, to seed the clouds to bring rain and so on. This system is how things evolve. The tree line is this dynamic team effort at making sense of new circumstances. All evolution is co-evolution. The idea of natural selection needs a lot of refining. We've always needed other species. And now the critical thing is that some of them rather, will need us too. The Boreal Forest is going to be fine because these trees, these hardy species like the birch and the pine and the larch, they've been riding the tides of ice up and down for millennia, because every time the ice age comes, it sends a sheet of ice down and then the trees follow hot on its heels. So actually, if you look at a time-lapse image of the globe, you'll see the tree line rising and falling like breath every 100,000 years, or at least that's how it's been for the last 3 million. The next ice age is postponed. The question is, who's going to live in that forest? So these trees, climate change is their core business. They've been doing this for a long time. But who's going to live in that forest? And at this moment, we are a bit like Noah and his ark. We can choose some of what survives the 6th extinction, including ourselves. So the question we have to ask is, do we want to be part of that assemblage of species which will co-evolve to survive the coming uncertainty? And if we do, there's a really demanding task ahead, which means we've got to rejoin nature. We've got to regain our place in nature. We've got to re-entangle ourselves with other species. We've got to get to know them again. We need to understand their names, their ways, and their needs. We cannot indulge any longer this idea of separation between humans and nature. How it goes for other species will be how it goes for future generations, this century and after. And if you're in any doubt, you just need to look at your thumbs, because we evolved in the trees. Humans have always been creatures of the forest. Thank you.
Ben, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. And yeah, so interesting to hear all about that. And I mean, that was pretty devastating as well. I mean, it makes me feel that we're extremely fortunate to have our last speaker tonight, Michael Ignatieff, whose book is called On Consolation. I feel in need of consolation after listening to that, although also kind of inspired that the future is still in our hands. Michael Ignatieff is incredibly well-known and powerful thinker, intellectual, writer, former politician. He now works and teaches from Vienna, although he is Canadian, and his book On Consolation is an incredibly timely book, as it asks us to examine courage, what you need to get through things, and he has done this in this book through a series of portraits of people who have found the courage to face their fates and to continue on unafraid. So quite frankly, on this particular day, and just having heard Ben's view about what's happening up in the Arctic, I can't think of a better question to be asking. So Michael, very big welcome to 5 by 15 from your home in Vienna, and over to you.
Thanks, Rosie. Emma, Huma, Honorée, Ben, it's been great to be with you, and now it's my turn. I want to talk to you about consolation. It's one of the most important things we can do for each other, and it's just about the most difficult. When we try to console ourselves, we can try to console other people, words usually fail us, and we just can't seem to reach across the gulf that separates us from someone else's sorrow, or even from our own. I recently visited an old friend of mine who just lost his wife. They'd been married for 50 years. I couldn't think of anything to say, so I brought him a cake from the cafe where he and his wife used to go when they were courting. And then he said, "If only I could believe I would see her again." He wouldn't allow himself to believe in an afterlife, and so the religious faith that's consoled people for thousands of years was closed to him. I kept him company, but mostly in silence. Being there, I hope, was some kind of comfort to him, but it was certainly no consolation. To comfort someone, you don't really need words at all. Just being there, offering them a slice of cake may be enough. But consolation is different. It's about giving meaning to suffering so that we can recover and find the hope to go on. But there's some losses, like losing a partner that you've been with for 50 years, which just leave us inconsolable. Consoling ourselves is even more difficult because it's not easy to tell ourselves the truth. When we fail, we tell ourselves we did our best. But really? When we lose a person we love, we tell ourselves that our love for them will never die. But really? In failure and grief, we confront bitter truths, and this can leave us shell-shocked, so that when we look in the mirror, we barely recognize ourselves. You can't think about consolation unless you begin by admitting that there's some experiences that just leave us inconsolable. Just as you can't write honestly about hope until you've lived a moment when hope is gone. But when we do admit that we're inconsolable, we begin to understand why we need consolation so much. And when we admit to feeling hopeless, that's when we can feel that hunger for hope return. When I began thinking about consolation years ago, friends looked at me kind of oddly, are you okay, Mike? Anything wrong? No, I said, I'm fine. I'm just interested in exploring this moment when we need words more than ever, but they fail us. My idea was to find words that wouldn't fail us. They had to be somewhere. in the Bible and the Psalms and the work of the great ancient philosophers. So for the past 4 years, I've been searching for these words from the deep recesses of the biblical past right up to the present day. At first, when I began thinking about consolation, I was alone with my thoughts. But when COVID hit and we all went into lockdown, suddenly everyone was looking for it. The internet was just filled with artists, writers, painters, actors, poets, politicians, all trying to make sense of our shared feelings of confusion and anger and fear, as the numbers who died went from the incredible to the mutely accepted. I remember an orchestra in Rotterdam performing Beethoven's Ode to Joy, each musician in their own apartment playing together on cues on their earphones. And a famous pianist performed Beethoven's sonatas from his apartment in Berlin every night. Poets declaimed, rappers rapped, intellectuals pontificated. All in all, the pandemic has been a terrible experience. But we need to remember how it produced some amazing new rituals of consolation. Remember those nights when we stood outside in our doors in masks and clapped the nurses and doctors fighting to save lives in our hospitals? Remember those amazing Italians and Spaniards who stood on their balconies every night and sang to each other? These rituals of consolation, I think, expressed how much we needed to be with each other, but also how much we needed to believe that we could beat the pandemic together and that there'd be a future beyond the lockdown. Now that we're into our fourth wave, we're still waiting for that future, but it does finally seem to be on the horizon. As I watched these invented rituals, I saw that consolation has two dimensions: solidarity in space, being together with others in the here and now so that we can share meaning and comfort, and solidarity in time, reaching back into the past to share what great artists and thinkers have understood about loss and fear and grief. Dark times like a pandemic lock us in a present that seems at first to be without a past or without a future. But we weren't the first, surely, and we won't be the last to go through a pandemic. Just consider the great Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius, who'd just taken power when in AD 165, a plague swept through his empire and carried away nearly a third of his people. The great book that he wrote, and that many of you have read, called The Meditations, I think needs to be understood as his struggle to give meaning to this catastrophe, a catastrophe, as it turned out, that claimed the life of the emperor himself. No wonder that he wrote that fate was cruel and capricious, and that all we could do was to meet it with firmness and courage. And then there's Michel de Montaigne, my favorite, the great French essayist who in the 1580s had to flee his own home to escape a plague that was devastating the region around Bordeaux where he lived. Montaigne and his family survived, and he learned by watching the peasants dying quietly in the fields around him, he learned to think of death differently, as something natural, inevitable, something even to be greeted as a friend. And he never gave up hope that he and his own family would survive. Montaigne and Marcus Aurelius's calm in the face of catastrophe was all the more impressive, given that they faced the pandemic with none of the weapons at our disposal: the masks, the vaccination, and that army of medical researchers who keep advancing our knowledge. Marcus Aurelius and Montaigne are interesting for another reason. They asked themselves whether philosophy was up to the task of providing meaning for the suffering they saw all around them. Their shelves were stocked with the wisdom of the ancients, and one of the greatest of those ancients was Boethius, a Roman senator who faced execution for defying a barbarian king, and he wrote a great book called The Consolation of Philosophy. But the title was, in fact, a question. Can philosophy actually console? By the end of his life, Michel de Montaigne, one of the most learned men of his time, began to question whether it could. For what actual redemptive or hopeful meaning could you give to a plague? Montaigne concluded that it was not philosophy, not doctrines about life that console, but life itself, its rituals and routines, and the people we live it with who provide us with the meaning we need to keep going, and whose love and care give us the hope to carry on. Marcus Aurelius, Boethius, and Montaigne were all courageous enough to question whether we can ever find meaning for suffering so that we can bear it better. But none of them ever gave up trying. In dark times, we can't afford to ignore these voices from the dead because they've been through it all. They know what we're going through, and we're not alone, and we never have been. Let me tell you one final story, and then I'll stop. It's about a wise woman, a British nurse who became a physician. She'd read all these philosophers and concluded, like them, that words alone were not enough. So she set out to do something, to find a way to console patients who were facing their own death. Her name was Cicely Saunders, and she founded the hospice movement and lived to see her model of palliative care adopted in hospitals and care homes around the world. I met Cicely Saunders in South London at the end of her life. She's a wonderful, tall woman with a brisk upper-class accent, an infectious laugh, and a deep intelligence that was based on a life spent listening by the bedside of the dying. What she learned was that pain for the dying was not just physical, it was spiritual. When Cicely asked one of her female patients where the pain was, the patient whispered, "All of me is wrong." If all of me was wrong, then palliative care had to address what was really bothering dying patients, not just the pain or the fear, but the longing to make things right with their families, to be reconciled with estranged children, to make provisions for the future, to settle old quarrels. Cicely understood that one essential meaning of consolation was to make your peace with life by making peace with those around you. There needed to be a place for this, and there needed to be time. Her hospice pioneered drug regimens that would take away the patient's pain, but leave them conscious so they could be with their families. Consolation needed a place, so Saunders created those cheerful hospice rooms where patients can be with their families. Consolation needed time, so she cleared the doctors and nurses away so patients could be with their families. Cicely Saunders did more than anyone I know to make dying bearable by creating a space and a time for consolation. She understood something profound about life, that we live for each other, and that even in the hour of our death, there's still something we can do for those we love, to take away their fear of dying by showing them, if we can, that dying might not be as hard as we thought. And that may be the most consoling thought of all. She was a wise woman, Cicely Saunders. And when she died in 2005 in her own hospice at the age of 87, we can only hope that she had the good death that she made possible for so many millions of people around the world. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was incredibly moving and amazingly just important to hear. And you're so right. And Cicely Saunders was an extraordinary woman. And I think that as a gift, if you can give someone a quote, a good death, where you can leave without all the panic of the muddles around you, then that is a very, very big human gift. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you all to Michael, to Honorée, to Huma, to Emma, and to Ben. It's been an absolutely wonderful nearly hour and a half. I couldn't have enjoyed it more, and I'm sure this is true of everyone. So I'm sorry that you're all scattered across the globe, but at least we all have your books that we can get to know and read and be in contact with you all. So until the next 5 by 15, thank you very, very much for an extremely special and profound evening, and good night.